Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to share with you some ideas in the Italian game, one of the oldest openings of them all. It has been already played in the 16th and 17th century. In those days, it was a very romantic era, and in the Italian game it usually involved very active and interesting games. Today, it has been tamed down a little. Black, of course, found better defensive skills than chess players had in those days, hundreds of years ago. Nevertheless, if White chooses to, the game can get rather interesting. The variation that we'll examine in this lesson will be an interesting version where it seems that White has a very good game, but as you shall see, things are not quite as simple as they at first look. The game we're looking at has been played between Rombaldoni and the Argentinian-born Grandmaster Garcia Palermo, who plays for Italy for many years now. So it started out with, here we go, e4, e5, and knight f3, knight to c6, bishop c4. So this is the starting position of the Italian game as we know it, and here Black has two main roads. One is to play bishop c5 as Black did in this actual game, and the other one would be, of course, to play knight f6. The two lead to distinctly different games usually, very interesting either way. Of course, Black has additional alternatives such as developing the bishop to e7 or even playing d6. However, those additional choices are considered inferior and less active. So bishop c5 is certainly a very logical move, develops, prepares to castle, and controls the d4 square. And White here has also several ways to go. White could castle, White could play d3, or play the most ambitious way, playing c3 right away, preparing d4. And in fact, instead of c3, there is a gambit line as well, the so-called Evans gambit, where White would play here surprisingly b4 with the idea that when the bishop or the knight captures, then those minor pieces would be attacked by c3, White gaining time on one hand in getting a faster control of the center, and also the bishop on c1 will get additional opportunities along either the long diagonal on a1 h8 or even on a3 f8. Now after bishop a5, let's say castle, and d6 and d4, let's say takes, and bishop b6. Look at this position. It's a standard position in the Evans gambit, and the reason why I'm showing this, because we will see a rather similar position in the actual game that we are examining. Here White has sacrificed the pawn, has a wonderful control of the center, and its bishop has some excellent potentials on b2, sometimes on a3, and oftentimes following it up by playing d5. In this position, White either chooses to play knight c3 as the legendary Paul Morphy played, and with ideas to later play e5 to open up the position, or Anderson's d5 is also an interesting approach, and then follow it up with a quick bishop b2, immediately pressuring on g7. If in this case the knight would go to a5, then also White can still play bishop b2, because if knight takes bishop now on c4, then g7 is hanging and then trapping the rook in the corner. So Black typically develops, for example with knight e7. Now of course capturing on g7 wouldn't be a great idea, because the rook would simply move away to g8, and then both bishops would be hanging. So the bishop retreats, black castles, and there is nothing immediate, but white simply develops with knight c3. And this is, for example, how one of the evergreen games have started as well. And white, interestingly, develops a rather strong attack with ideas of moving the knight to e2, playing h3, getting the king out of the way, rather surprisingly, then g4, and getting the knight to g3 and f5. So if you can picture that reorganizing of the pieces and developing the attack, it can be rather dangerous for black, especially in view of the power of white's bishop on b2 towards the g7 pawn. And of course, if you imagine the white knight getting to f5, also pressuring the g7 pawn, with the white g2 pawn being on g4, and then the idea is that any time there would be a trade on f5, whether with the black bishop on c8 or the knight on e7, white would capture back with the g pawn, followed by the rook from f1 going to g1, and the attack could be really, really nice. So let's go back to our game, because we got a little bit carried away here. And a few more moves back. We're not examining the Evans Gambit today, but continuing with the more solid c3 move, Italian game, without any pawn sacrifice. And here the most common move is to play knight f6 for black immediately to put pressure on white's e4 pawn, when white either indeed protects it or plays d4, which leads to a rather interesting game, but it involves a pawn sacrifice on white's side, usually by capturing, and then check, a very important check. And now, for example, if white plays knight c3, then knight e4, and it's a long story, which I'm not planning to get into, but very wild and interesting game. So let's go back again some moves, and we're gonna see a game where black played d6, which has been always considered somewhat inferior because it doesn't make any attempt to prevent or even to prepare for white's d4 move. In fact, it says, go ahead, I don't care, I'll let you have the center. So let's see how this game developed. White castled, black played knight f6, and white was ready to play d4. So what this typically means is that now, whether black trades on d4 or they don't, they no longer will have a check on b4, as we've seen in the previous variation. So after take, bishop b4 is not a check, so therefore white is not losing the e4 pawn. And by the way, instead of trading, bishop b6 is possible too. And in that case, takes, and white can win a pawn temporarily on f7. However, black real quick gets that pawn back on e4. Moreover, black immediately is threatening to play rook f8. And as you can see, black already pressures the f2 pawn twice with the bishop and the knight, and then the third piece, black's rook, will also be aiming towards that pinned f2 pawn. So therefore, black wouldn't have any dangers. So let's go back again to this position where white played d4, and black here didn't move the bishop back right away, although that's a possibility too, but traded on d4 and played bishop b6. Generally, it has been viewed that this is the dream for white, because white has a full control of the center, white has space advantage, is doing fine with development, and yet, as you shall see, things are not quite as simple here either. The big differences in this position compared to the ones we saw from the Evans Gambit, on one hand, that white has an extra pawn on b2, but at the same time that's not only a plus, but it also is somewhat of a restriction in that the white bishop doesn't get to that diagonal so easily or so quickly. So the question is, what should white do right now? One option is to play knight c3 simply to protect the pawn, perhaps the best option. And then, interestingly, if black follows up with the immediate bishop g4, trying to put pressure indirectly on the d4 pawn, then white will follow up with bishop e3, protecting it. Let's say castles, and white will push the issue on provoking the trade on f3 with the idea to now take back with the pawn, then get the king out of the way on the g file, quickly move the rook to g1 and create an attack. For example, after knight h5, king h2, queen h4, rook g1, knight f4, and the white rook arrives right on time to g3, protecting on h3. Interestingly, this position has already been reached in a real old game all the way in 1894 between two great players of those days, Albin and Showalter. And the game continued with king h8, black getting out of the pin of white's light squared bishop. And now the problem is that queen d2 comes, chasing the knight out, and the game continued with g5, when after knight d5, black's position pretty much fell apart. So let's go back quite a bit, all the way to the beginning, and then let's go back to this position where white played d4, takes, bishop b6, and as we saw, perhaps knight c3 is the better idea, but white played differently. White played d5 along the ways, as we saw, that white plays in the Evans gambit in similar positions without having the b2 pawns. However, as you shall see, things are not so easy, and in fact in some ways things are different. Black now moved the knight to e7, getting ready to get to g6 when the time is ripe. And now in the meantime, white is busy to protect the pawn on e4, as there is no bishop b2 move which would indirectly protect it, and played knight c3. And black simply castled. So let's see for a moment what's going on here in this position. White still has a nice looking position in the center. However, we can see a clear difference between two bishops, one on c4, kind of biting into a wall of his own pawn on d5, while the black bishop on b6 is really excellent looking, pinning white's pawn on f2, and at times it can be even targeting it with the knight g4, for example, in situations if the white rook would move away from f1. Black's plan, next few moves at least, are pretty clear. The idea would be to play knight g6, rook to e8, and then develop the bishop to g4 or d7, dependent on how white continues. In the meantime, white's bishop on c1 has some difficulties in finding a reasonable square, because, for example, if the bishop goes to g5, black continues with knight g6, just as part of its plan, and then can chase back the white bishop, which won't have a very ideal square. Similarly, if the white bishop develops to f4, black would continue with knight g6, and after bishop g3, knight h5, and then again one of the black knights will appear on f4 with excellent potential. And finally, playing b3 in trying to develop the bishop to the long diagonal with bishop b2 would have problems after bishop a5, which immediately would target white's knight on c3, the defender of the e4 pawn. So, as we can tell, things are not quite as easy for white as we would hope they would be. White here in the meantime played h3, a move trying to prevent the black bishop or sometimes knight getting to g4, but it's not the most fortunate choice. Perhaps a better idea was trying to play rook e1 and then bishop e3. In this position, white continued with h3, trying to prevent the arrival of black's bishop or knight on g4. However, the best approach was instead playing knight d4, and then when knight g6, a4, a6, a5, bishop a7, gaining some space on the queen side, and now prepare the development of the bishop to e3, preventing knight g4. After the immediate bishop e3, of course, that's what would have happened. Knight e5, bishop e2, and then the next move, for example, after c6, bishop e3, and white has a comfortable position. But let's go back to the actual game, where instead of knight d4, white continued with h3 with the idea to prevent any black piece appearing on g4. Game knight g6 as planned, rook e1. Now that there is no more knight g4, it's a playable move. Rook e8. Now this move intends to prevent the natural development of white's bishop to e3 because it put pressure on the e4 pawn a second time. And here white had an interesting, perhaps better idea than what was tried, namely playing again a4 first, and for example if a5, then regrouping the bishop to f1 followed by g3 and bishop g2, and then white has a very solid position and a good control of the dark squares on the king's side. But that's not what white chose to do. White continued with knight d4 just a little bit later than I suggested before, and now the idea is for white to try to trade the light squared bishop, for example after bishop d7, bishop b5, but black prevented that. Very smart move, playing a6. And now again I would suggest to play a4 if I would be white, but white played differently, and b4 immediately here wasn't such a hot idea. You shall see why. Black responded with knight h5, aiming to get to f4. And if you think of it, by playing b4 with the idea of bishop b2, white just weakens further those dark squares on the king's side. And as you'll see, black develops an excellent attack exactly along those lines. Now, of course, knight h5, the point is that if white captures, then black also captures a knight, and then immediately attacks a second knight on c3. The best choice at this point was to change the course of action and develop the bishop to e3 anyway, despite playing b4 on the previous move, to neutralize black's initiative along the dark squares, and then after knight f4 retreat the bishop, and then eventually try to chase the knight back if the opportunity comes. But instead white didn't play bishop e3 but played knight f5, which is a good idea. The problem is though that black can capture it. In fact, black did capture it. Now if pawn captures back, the black knight just jumps to f4. White captured black's knight on h5 instead, and now here came perhaps the surprise that white underestimated, that the black bishop doesn't need to retreat immediately, but black has an excellent intermediate move by playing queen f6, counterattacking white's knight on c3. Also remember the pin that the white pawn on e4 is in, due to the fact that the white rook on e1 is on an unprotected square. Of course, also a little trick, if bishop b2 for example, then bishop f2 followed by a discovered check, and white is in serious trouble. So let's go back again to the position after queen f6, where white continued with queen f3, protecting the knight on c3. By the way, there was another interesting possibility in this position. If white now plays bishop e3, then black could take on e4, winning a pawn, and if bishop b6, bishop g2, a very fine move because of the fork coming with knight f4, and if the bishop retreats, bishop f3 attacks the queen, and then the knight on c3 is falling. So all these tactical elements kind of work out for black quite well in this particular position. And the biggest reason why that is the case, because of black's beautiful bishop on b6, it really dominates the situation. So white continued with queen f3, trying to defend that f2 weakness as well as protect the knight. And now black played very well by bishop d4. Keep pushing the issue, attacking the knight on c3 a second time, bishop b2, and knight e5. If now queen takes bishop, black just trades and then follows up by taking on c4, attacking a second bishop. The only way for white to escape losing further material is to trade rooks and then attack the black bishop, but white loses a pawn after bishop takes and knight takes. So this certainly would favor black, and therefore after knight e5, white continued with queen e2, protecting the bishop. But this is kind of even worse, because now came a domination on the king's side. White has too many of his own pieces on the queen side. As you can see, black has 4 or even 5 pieces on the king's side. Well, the bishop on d4 is logistically on d4 on the queen side, but in all reality it is very much an active participant of the attack on the king's side. So now white is in major trouble. The game ended after white accepted the sacrifice. Came knight takes, queen takes check, and another check, king h2, bishop check, and another check. Now the king needs to run, otherwise checkmate. And after queen g2, black simply wins the bishop on b2 and will be 3 pawns ahead, not to talk about the fact that the white king is totally naked and in major trouble. What an elegant game and well-played game by black. And as you can see, even with white, if you just make so-so moves, kind of natural moves, but without any clear plan or ignoring your opponent's plans, like in this case weakening the dark squares, you can get in major trouble relatively quickly. So I hope you learned some interesting ideas from this instructive game. And now let's see the jewel of the week. Here we are in this endgame, which has a bishop and a knight on each side, and white having an extra pawn, generally would lead to a draw, because typically what would happen, that when the white pawn advances, for example to c7, the black bishop would capture it, and one extra piece without any pawns on the board typically is not sufficient to win the game. However, in this case, white can win the game, and by distracting the black bishop from holding off the white pawn. Try to figure out how white should do that. Then come back and listen to the correct answer. And the answer is bishop c3, sacrificing the bishop. So after bishop takes, white can now advance the pawn. Now black has 3 reasonable tries. As the bishop can never control the promotion square, that's a light square, opposite color than the bishop, only the knight could try to catch the pawn. But then what happens is white plays knight e7, and after knight d6, sadly for black, white has another distraction move, knight f5, distracting the knight, and then pawn is ready to promote, not only promote, but immediately create a fork on black's bishop and knight. What a beautiful idea. And finally, let's go back and see what happens if after c7 the bishop tries to win the pawn. Well, knight simply moves to d6, and then again the pawn promotes. And alternatively, if instead the bishop goes to e5, then knight d6, and again the pawn promotes, and this is an objectively winning endgame for white, because the pieces are too far from each other. Well, I hope you enjoyed this beautiful endgame as well as the instructive game in the Italian, and be back next time for some more chess ideas. Thanks for listening.